All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Merritt. I teach in the history department, and I think I have you captive for the next hour because I'm going to be talking about podcasting and then about digital museums, which are projects that I've been implementing in my classes for the last 3 semesters. So I'm excited to share with you some of the things that my students have produced in both FYS and history classes. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some of the reasons why I use podcasting, and then I'll also switch to digital museums later, the technology that's required for these kinds of projects. Then I'll show you some student examples so you can see what it is that students have produced. And then I'm going to kind of turn it over to the students in some ways by letting you read feedback that students have written about their experiences, first with podcasts and then with digital museums. Okay, so first of all, podcasting. How many of you listen to podcasts? Yeah, most of you, it seems like. It's gotten much more popular, and I found that with students as well, whereas a few years ago, I found that many students didn't listen to them, and now it seems like more and more are starting to catch on. And so I started using podcasting, and I should add that I couldn't have done it without Adam's help and the staff of instructional technology and our librarians. Because Adam and I were talking about ways in which to engage students in terms of things like writing and researching, really essential skills that they need, but also in how to practice digital literacy and how to use those skills outside of traditional essays. And so we decided to experiment with these podcast projects beginning last spring or spring of 2018. It's kind of taken off from there. And so some of the reasons why I started using them was one had to do with preventing fatigue by using varied assignments. So I teach history classes, which are very essay intensive, and by the end of the semester, if you also teach writing intensive classes, students often get really tired of writing essays over and over again. But obviously it's important, and so I thought, well, they need to learn, again, how to practice these skills of writing communication, but what are other ways that they can do this to give that variation? And also help them understand that writing is not just something that they do for professors. It's also something that they need for their whole lives. And so how can we give them other ways to learn how to write for different audiences and communicate in different ways? I also wanted them to have practice working with a group. So often essay writing is, of course, a very individual solo task. And working with a group for a podcast gave them a chance to collaborate and use teamwork. Also implement research skills. So in the podcast, at least for my classes, students have to integrate peer-reviewed research in order to back what they say on the podcast. If you choose to use podcasts in your classes, or maybe you already do, you may or may not want to do that depending on the purpose of what you're doing, but that's what my students need to do. And also giving them a chance to have choice in what they do. All right, so they're allowed to do whatever topic they want for podcasts. And so in a class like, say, a survey of European history, in which we go over many things over the course of the semester, but maybe we skip over, I don't know, the revolutions of 1848, and a student just can't stand that we did that. Well, then this is their chance. They get to learn about what it is that I skipped over. And it makes them feel like they really get some control over their own learning, and also they get to be creative. Of course, practicing digital literacy. So I tell my students that even if you never make a podcast again, you will have to spend your whole lives learning how to use new technologies and learning how to communicate in these different ways. And then finally, the last piece is it also gives them opportunity to teach their peers, because I do play all the podcasts in class at the end of the semester, so they learn what each other has been up to. And so they learn not just from me, but also from each other, which they tend to find very powerful. And then the technology that is required for this is the program that students use is one called Audacity. And that's a free program that they can put on their own laptops. So they don't have to go to a lab if they don't want to. They don't have to, they can record everything in their dorm rooms if they want. And then they can capture audio just on their phones and import it into Audacity and then edit the podcast there. So it's very, in terms of the technological demand, it's very low and easy for students who've never done this before to learn how to do it. And then in some of my classes, I have them import their podcast into a PowerPoint to include visual aids, which I'll show you an example of in a little bit. Other options, some students know how to record and edit already, so I let them do that if they already have experience with a different platform. So I want them to do what they're comfortable with. And I should add, and I'll go through the process in a little while, I should add that instructional technology and the librarians are very involved in this, so they'll come into my classroom and teach students how to record and edit podcasts. So again, I'm very reliant on their help for these projects, but the students love being able to work with library staff in addition to me. All right, with that in mind, I'm going to play one example of a student podcast from FYS from this past fall. And just to give you a little bit of background on this project, this particular podcast, its purpose was to teach students how to do academic research. Right, so that was the whole purpose, because of course they have to write that research paper in the spring. So in the fall, I went, all right, in the fall, let's work on, for one assignment, learning how to do that research that you'll have to do in the spring. And so we did something kind of fun, which we actually came in this room one night and we watched Black Panther together. Has anyone seen Black Panther in the movie? Okay, so we all came in here and we watched it. And then students chose a scene from Black Panther to analyze in more depth. So I said, well, what do you think's going on behind this scene? Or can you take us deeper? Like imagine you're a cultural critic and you're going in depth into this scene. And find some academic sources that help you go a little bit deeper, help you make some more connections. And so the podcast I'm going to play for you was by 3 of my FYS students, so they work in groups of 3, who are analyzing a particular scene from Black Panther using their academic research to try to take it a little bit deeper.
Hello everyone, Amanda, Melissa, and Jonathan here to discuss the importance of the different ideologies between Njobu and T'Chaka. We will dive in further and cover how this scene relates to the surroundings of the past, present, and future, and how it ties into the real world.
A quick overview of what occurred in the scene is T'Chaka, king of Wakanda, confronts his brother Njobu about his betrayal of Wakanda. This betrayal was a result of Njobu observing how Black people were being oppressed, therefore leading to his radicalized ideology.
The brothers have 2 drastic views when approaching oppression. T'Chaka believes in a more isolated route due to Wakanda's history and policy of isolation and secrecy. Therefore, he chooses not to help those suffering in the world in order to protect his people's way of life and to keep advanced Wakandan technology due to the large amounts of vibranium a secret. Njobu, on the other hand, believes in a more radicalized plan in which vibranium would be used to start a Third World War by masking it as fighting against oppression of Black people around the world.
One piece of literature that relates to this scene is Unnameable Objects, Unspeakable Crimes by James Baldwin. Baldwin states, and one begins to suspect an awful thing, that people believe they deserve their history, and that when they operate on this belief, they perish. Njobu is on the front lines and is immersed in the daily struggles of his neighbors around him. He continually sees people fall into the trap of believing that they deserve their history. An example would be the evolution of slavery into the Jim Crow laws, which has evolved into unjust treatment and racism. This constant evolving has crippled one into believing that they deserve their history. Therefore, Njobu acts out in order to stop this domino effect.
Another piece of literature that relates to the scene is Afrofuturism, Future World by Ytasha L. Womack. Womack describes Afrofuturism allows for the reimagination of one's identity. Njobu has come to an understanding where he knows the past cannot be changed. Instead, he looks towards the future for inspiration in which he can build a world with the help of vibranium controlled by Wakanda itself.
To tie this into the real world, we can analyze 2 prominent figures during the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Both shared the same common goal, but each had their own way of approaching that same goal.
MLK showed the world the importance of ending racial discrimination and segregation in a more peaceful manner, versus Malcolm X's more radicalized methods. Malcolm X's approach was to use violence and to urge followers to defend themselves against white aggression. In his words, by any means necessary. As MLK states, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in the moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at the times of challenge and controversy. There are two main reasonings behind the violent versus nonviolent approaches. One conclusion as to why Malcolm, as well as Ninjobu, chose the more violent route is because the result is much faster. To change one's outlook on the world takes time, making the peaceful route much slower. The second reason as to why Malcolm and Ninjobu chose their ways is because they want to inflict the same feeling of being oppressed on their oppressors. MLK knew that if that route of violence was taken, nothing would ever change in the world, and they would be caught in a never-ending cycle.
In the article, Violence and Nonviolence in the Success of the Civil Rights Movement, published March 2016 in the New Political Science by August Nimitz. August states that nonviolent mass protests are often considered as having been mainly responsible for the two major legislative gains of the Civil Rights Movement. MLK's peaceful approach shows that in the long run it is more effective in gaining ground and bettering the lives of African Americans than Malcolm's approach.
In the article, Is Violence Sometimes a Legitimate Right?, published August 2014 in Diogenes by Sullivan. Sylvie states that campaigners bolsters an erroneous reading of the freedom struggle of African Americans, leaving the impression that the resort to violence and self-defense propounded by Malcolm X was a purely circumstantial departure from the general strategy of the civil rights movement. This quote ties into Njobu's whole belief into why violence is the best resort. It is all purely circumstantial. He believes Wakanda's isolation does more harm to the African people than actually igniting a war that would benefit his people.
What we can take with us from this scene is that both brothers' ideologies, although flawed, share one common goal, and that was for the betterment of their people. From the readings, we can connect that history shapes a person's thoughts and views, therefore ultimately affecting their future. Once that viewpoint is overlooked, they can begin to imagine an alternate future in which they no longer struggle but thrive. T'Chaka and Njobu are no different from MLK or Malcolm X. Both shared the same goal, but had different ways of approaching it. Ultimately, what we can take away is that the past and the future go hand in hand. It teaches us that we can either repeat the past or overcome it.
Okay, so that was, again, from a first semester FYS class. And again, the purpose of that podcast was not so much about Black Panther, but again about getting students comfortable with using academic research, which again they would have to do in more depth in the spring. And I'd like to emphasize that for a podcast, students have to write and work off of scripts. So I'm going to show you an example of what a podcast script looks like, in which they of course have speaking roles. And they cite their research throughout the podcast as well as orally, as you heard them doing in that last podcast. So in some ways it resembles writing an essay, but of course the format is much different, and they have to think a lot more about audience when they are writing a script. And so I encourage students to take their scripts to the Writing Center so they can work with Writing Center tutors as they are formulating it and practice it with each other as they're thinking about what their podcast will sound like. And then I'm going to play one more example from a student podcast, but I won't play the whole thing in the interest of time. But this is an example of one for a history class in which students analyze a primary source in their podcast. And for this, I have them embed their presentation into a PowerPoint. One reason I did this was because I wanted to give them the opportunity to use visual aids to illustrate what they were saying, but also because it's really awkward to sit and listen to your voice, if any of you have ever done that before. And so I thought it would make the students feel more comfortable if they could look at something while they were listening to their podcast in class, which has been very effective for my history classes. So I'll just play a minute or two of this presentation by students, and this is a 100 level history class. in which they analyze a primary source from 1939 in France.
Humanities.
And I'm Grace Hallmeyer. We're students at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict. On today's episode of What
After World War I, Germany's intentions were misleading. Hitler broke the Treaty of Versailles to make Germany a global superpower.
he annexed Austria, his home country. Then, he turned his attention to Poland.
Poland divided Germany into East and West, and had easy access to the ocean. Hitler wanted to annex Poland to expand Germany's power.
France's response to the invasion of Poland is complex. This invasion forever changed the way the world powers respond to one another. On September 2nd, 1939, one day after Hitler invaded Poland, French Premier Edward Daladier issued a public address. This document is particularly interesting because it addresses multiple audiences.
The countries of Europe are one audience. Daladier says that France and England cannot look on when a friendly nation is being destroyed.
I like that you chose this quote. It really shows France's responsibility for protecting Poland. Darrell Press, the faculty director at Dartmouth College, explains this responsibility in his article, The Credibility of Power, published in 2004. Press states that France was bound by a 1921 treaty to come to Poland's aid in the event of a German attack.
So France had to come to Poland's defense because of this treaty. What else?
All right, so I know you're hungry for more, but I just want to make sure that we. But anyway, in this example, you can see that this was two students working together. They're again analyzing this speech by the Premier of France in 1939. And again, they're using this academic research that they've done to try to go deeper into the meanings of the speech. And what I liked about this podcast in particular was that they analyzed that the premier was speaking to multiple audiences, not only to France, but also the people of Europe and to Germany, and that it had many different effects because of the multiple audiences. So again, in the 100-level history class, they're also practicing things like doing research, writing, communicating to different audiences, but also learning how to analyze primary sources, and again, diving into topics that they choose, not topics that I choose. So with that, I'm going to let you read some of the reflections that students wrote at the end of the semester after they finished the podcast, and some of the things that they felt like they learned through the process. And so what I have them do is, after the podcast projects are over, they write a reflection in which they think about what they learned. They compare making a podcast to writing a paper. They talk about what they learned from collaborating with others. And these are some of the things that they said about writing. And one thing I found with podcast script writing that's a little different than essay writing is because they do have quite a lot of creativity and flexibility in how they choose to structure it, is they tend not to be quite as stressed about writing the script as they do with a regular essay. It tends to free them from this sense of being confined by a particular structure. And so, but at the same time, they also reflect that they have to do many of the same things for writing that they do for an essay. And so they have to, be critical in how they give their points, think really hard about how they organize their information and communicate their argument. And then they also learn through writing a script how to streamline their language and not just kind of talk on and on, because they only have about 5 minutes or so to complete their podcast, and so they have to be very careful and precise about the language that they use. So they learn a lot about revision in this process as well as they go through their podcast script and keep working on it. As I've emphasized, they also learn about research skills and how they can apply the academic research that they're learning how to do in different contexts. And so they think about, how do I actually use my research? They come to understand as they're doing this research, it's very complicated. How do I distill this in 5 minutes for an audience? And so they think very hard about how to actually utilize what they've learned. They also like to apply their research skills to something besides an essay. So it helps them see ways in which these skills that they're learning in college will help them maybe in other contexts. And then they also like to learn how to understand and go deeper into a topic, that maybe they had a curiosity about, but then they're learning, well, these are ways I can research and learn more, and then tell someone about what I learned. A third thing that students reflect that they learn from the podcast projects is the value of collaboration, because of course they all do this in groups. And one thing I love seeing in class is students kind of huddled around their laptops, all working at the same time on a shared Google Doc that they're all continuously editing. And so they're editing each other's work, they're putting their comments on their scripts and revising it together. And it gives one of those, I think, rare chances to write as a group, which again is so often an individual process. They also, students who like kind of hands-on projects really enjoy this kind of work because they can work with others. They find it to be fun instead of maybe the more solo process of writing an essay. And one thing I love as a historian is that they learn that there are many ways to interpret a primary source. So this isn't a history class, and their partner might be like, well, I thought the source meant this. This is what I was going to write in my part of the script. And the other said, no, this is how I read it. And so they're learning that it's a process of interpretation and how to implement those different perspectives. Another thing is the attention to audience. So again, I think often when students write essays, they're of course writing to their professor, hoping to get a good grade. And in doing the podcast project, it makes them think about how to communicate, orally, but also to an audience that's not just their instructor, right? So maybe a general audience, to their peers, and it makes them think about when they're writing in general, who are they writing to? Who are they writing for? And so they talk a lot in their reflections about focusing on their audience, focusing on their voice, and again, helping them think about communication in these multiple ways. And then again, learning how to work with others to how to communicate their ideas effectively. And then the last thing is engagement. So going back to what I said was one of the initial purposes of the podcast project was to vary the assignments, kind of stimulate student interest. And so one thing it does is that we play them at the end of the semester when students are getting kind of tired. They're ready to be done. And then now all of a sudden we sit in class one day and we listen to each other's podcasts and you get to hear what everyone else has been working on. It kind of creates this excitement. And so they learn about other aspects of history. They get to learn what everyone else has been up to. They think about how this is interactive. For students who don't really like writing papers, it gives them something different to do while they're still practicing the same skills. And then it has a sense of interest, right? So it keeps them interested at the end of the semester by varying what it is that they do. All right, so I'm going to end this part of the presentation about podcasts by just talking about if you want to do a podcast project in your class, steps you can do. And I'm also going to show some resources that instructional technology has as well. So when I do these in my classes, we start with a group form in which students either choose a group or ask to be assigned to a group. They identify primary sources they're interested in analyzing or what the topic of their podcast is going to be. And then they submit those. And then we do an in-class brainstorming session in which instructional technology and a librarian come in and help the students think about how are you actually going to do this? How are you going to write a script? There's a treatment form that they work through. So thinking about together in class, again, that takes 30 minutes in class, what their next steps are going to be. And then they start working on the rough draft of their script. And so for a 5-minute podcast, that's going to be about 500 words. So not super long. So again, they have to be very careful in how they choose their words. Of course, the podcast can be longer than that. I just limit it to 5 minutes so I can play them all in one class period at the end of the semester. And so they turn in a rough draft, which I require them to take to the Writing Center first so they can show it to another audience. I comment on their rough draft and give it back to them. And then we take one full class period in which instructional technology comes in and teaches the students how to record and edit podcasts. So by the end of that class, they all know exactly how to record and edit and export their podcasts so that they can be turned in. And then they turn in their final script, a draft of the recording, which we listen to and kind of try to catch any additional bugs. And then we play them in class, which is both kind of exciting but also nerve-wracking for the students, as again, they have to listen to their own voices. And I tell them that it is a great opportunity to practice self-awareness. This is what you sound like. So think about that in the future. People are always going to be listening to you. You need to know what you sound like. And then they write the reflection in which they reflect on what they learned from their projects as well as from the projects of others. And then to give you an idea of some of the things that instructional technology provides for support in the classroom, if you're interested in doing these kinds of projects, is if you go to their website, there's a tab here for podcasting and audio projects, which they've recently added, which is very helpful. And there's a sequence, which is similar to kind of what I laid out here, that they recommend for following if you want to implement podcast projects in your class. And again, these podcasts are very flexible. I showed you more of like the history or my particular FYS approach, but they can be adapted in endless ways. And you see here those different skills and steps that instructional technology has identified, and the staff that they recommend. So this is what I do. Like I have Adam usually, and then Molly often also, because she's the history librarian, will come in and help the students with the research. Adam will help with the technology part. And then various tips and guidelines. And one thing that's really helpful that Kyle helped develop with the Writing Center tutors is CSBSJU actually has published guidelines about how to write a podcast script. And so again, this is available on that website for instructional technology with different ideas of how to write a script, which is of course different than writing an essay, thinking about the audience, thinking about this is going to be said aloud, not just written down, and various tips and tricks. So of course I have my students use this as they're composing their scripts. And then also the technology, so Audacity, which I mentioned earlier. And then the last thing is that there is a Canvas page that has many resources, things like how to use your voice that Sean Dooley made, which is a great video. Things like how to use Audacity, various things through NPR and New York Times about creating podcasts and how to think about those. And this is a site that's constantly having more things added to it. As people who work on podcasts find things that are helpful. They add it to the Canvas site, and what you can do is you can import that Canvas site into your own Canvas site as like a page, which is what I do. So my students have all of the tools they need in one place as they are working on their projects. So again, I very much encourage, if you want to do something like this, to work with instructional technology to help figure out the timeline and plan and how to integrate the technology along with the goals that you have for your projects. That's all I have for podcasts. Does anyone have questions about anything that I talked about or showed you? Yeah.
Not so much as a question as something I wanted to add from my classroom podcasting experience. Some students have really old, crappy phones, and the sound quality is not going to be very good. They also have the alternative of checking mics out from instructional technology that they can use to do recording and get a much better quality recording for the same amount of effort. Like, it takes 30 seconds to check out the mic. So
yes. Yes, thank you, Kelly. Absolutely. My students have done that as well, who don't have phones that they want to use, so that's definitely an option. Thank you. Yeah.
I have a practical question. So I know what a podcast is in its finished product, and I know what a script is. And I could work with students on developing a script, but I don't know how a podcast is made, and I probably wouldn't figure it out very easily. So I was wondering how you deal with the logistical issues of the technological side of things. I mean, surely students have questions at times, or they would for me, that I would not know the answer to. What to do technically, right? Which button to push at what time. So for that reason, I would tend to stay away from this. But I mean, if it's not a principal reason, or if you have a way of working around it, I'd be interested in hearing it.
That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. Thank you. I also don't know how to actually make a podcast. And I don't know how to import audio into PowerPoint and have it timed to go play across slides like my students know how to do. And so again, that's why I emphasize working with instructional technology does know how to do all these things, and we'll come in the class and teach students how to make a podcast from beginning to end. But on top of that, you're right, you do get technical questions from students. And I send them to Adam or other instructional technology staff. And what I like about that, there's several things I actually like about when students run into problems in terms of the technology. And it forces them to ask for help, which I think students often don't want to do, but they have to learn how to ask for help to finish that. And it encourages them to see library staff as resources that they can go to and work with. So I think often students think, well, the library staff, they just check out books. And they don't think of library staff as teachers and allies for their education as well. And so it encourages students, the technical problems encourage students to go and seek help from librarians who know how to do these things. And so Adam can tell you that when my students are working on their podcast projects, he's constantly getting emails from them. Like, sit down with me, show me how to integrate this. It's not working on my laptop. And so they will go and work with Adam to figure out the technical glitches. He'll be fielding emails telling them things like that, what to do. So all that to say is I kind of take the technological problems and place them on instructional technology. And so I work with them more on the scripts, and then the technical part library staff helps with. Here, Carol.
Did you have any issues? It sounded like they were really responded positively to working with script, which would be an unusual sort of writing format.
Mm-hmm.
Just personally, I've had issues sometimes with students when I shift that expectation. They
Mm-hmm.
sometimes struggle with, okay, now what? And I'm wondering, did you find that at all initially? And if so, do you have any suggestions around it?
Most students prefer, they do have trouble at first because they haven't maybe written scripts before, so they don't really quite understand the process. But once they start doing it, because they're working with others, they're getting kind of support and ideas that they're bouncing off of other people. And they also, I encourage them to listen to podcasts and think about, well, why do you even need a script? Why put this in a conversational form? This is also why I have them turn in a rough draft, because often what they'll turn into me with the rough draft is an essay. And I'm like, this is great. Can you include, like, who's going to say what? And let's think about having a conversation with each other. Like, we're two historians sitting in a coffee shop talking about our favorite primary source that we read today and what we think about it, right? And one of the things I was talking about, one of the things that I'm still working with my students is trying to figure out how to go from sounding like you're reading to having that conversation. But because I focus more on the things that they're saying rather than how they're saying it right now, at least in my classes, the podcasts aren't going to sound like This American Life. But that's okay for me right now. So anyway, that's a roundabout answer to your question, which is that students at first are a little uncomfortable with the script format, but they end up loving it for the most part, except for the small portion of students who love writing essays and wish they never had to work in groups because they're so good at writing essays and they just want to write more and more of them. So you do get that who kind of complain about it. But what I've also found is that students who have a lot of anxiety with writing traditional essays find this to be very empowering. I've had multiple examples of students who had such crippling anxiety about writing essays that they wouldn't turn in an essay all semester, and then they wrote the podcast script because they were doing it with other people. And something about being away from the strict essay format freed them to be like, I can communicate, I can write. And then they went and they turned in their essays that were late, because they're like, okay, I can actually do this. And so for some students like that, they actually find this to be a very empowering, useful way of practicing those same skills.
And a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
How much time do you recommend for those revisions? Right?
I think I give them 2 weeks. Yeah. And so once we start, everything is really about 2 weeks, spaced out about 2 weeks. So we do like our brainstorm session, and they have 2 weeks to write the script, then 2 weeks to revise, and then record, and then play them in class. So we start, like in the spring, we start immediately after spring break, and then work on it just kind of in steps up until the end of the semester. Derek.
I was just thinking about audience a little bit too. I've been doing this for a while, but are you having these posted so people can download them anywhere, or are only your students in your class having access to them?
No, I don't have that. They own their own podcast, so they can share them if they want to, but I don't post them for anyone to listen to, because I kind of feel like for the students it's their property, and so it's up to them if they want to display it. But I also tell them, and I kind of joke with them, like, you should think of this as you're going for a run and you're listening to your favorite history podcast, and like think about anyone could listen to this. But I don't actually post it for the public. Was there another question?
If you have, so you might end up with a group work of some students, say, being maybe more dominant or taking over the project more than others, or maybe you could end up in a situation where somebody is just lazy and doesn't contribute. I was wondering how you deal with asymmetry of workload and kind of keeping that even.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem, and that's a problem for any group work, obviously. And so I have my students kind of write group agreements at the beginning. They in their treatment form that they do for the podcast, they assign roles to each other. They divide responsibilities. So some might be more responsible for the editing part, others more for this part. And then in their final reflection, they evaluate themselves as well as their group members. So I try to at the beginning set up a idea of accountability and then follow through at the end as they evaluate their contribution to their group and then their group members' contribution. Any other podcasting questions? Yeah, Josh.
Not a question, just a couple comments I wanted to point out. First, if you are interested in this, there's 4 instructional technology specialists on campus. That pretty much our sole job is to work with you on stuff like this. So if you're interested in learning more about it, if you go to our website, there's a classroom integration form. Just fill that out. It shoots us an email and we'll get in contact with you about how to do this. And then for your second question about group members and contributions, one of the other faculty members we work with, as part of the end of the project, he makes the students actually grade each other on their contributions. So they'll give each other you get a 10 out of 10 or you get a 7 out of 10. And that seemed to work really well in his class, at least, to hold each other's group members accountable.
Thank you, Josh. No, that's great. Thank you. Adam, do you want to add anything?
You know, one thing I found, because to a degree everyone is speaking some parts, there is certain level of accountability. So even if someone is a really dominant voice, they just find that, oh, maybe I shouldn't be talking as much. I like to talk a lot myself. So I have to be aware. But we have a lot of other resources like citation guidelines, so students know how to cite information properly. And the blue circle, the review step, we actually found to be the most beneficial, because very often students submit, like they say, too much. Say, well, you need 500 words and you have 750. So, and now students realize it's actually not as easy. But it's fun to see them taking the ownership and pride of their work.
Just reminded me of a great moment in the podcast when my student group said, we met in the lab with Adam and they were going to learn how to use Audacity, and one group looked up at me before class started and they said, Kelly, we interviewed Father René McGraw. He talked for 11 minutes, and our podcast is supposed to be 10 minutes or less. How are we going to use that? And I said, well, you're the editors. You're going to choose. And so they had to find, and they did a fantastic job. They had him seamlessly answering their questions in short sound bites. That was very empowering for them.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelly.